All right, so any students here? People who are one-time students, people who know that there have been at various times throughout history students, and that any of you have student loan debt or have had student loan debt? Yeah, so I have a proposal for you guys, and that's let's add $400,000 to your bill. Only instead of getting something for it like an education, we're just going to give all that money to other people. Any takers? Oh, you guys are cold. I mean, I expected a little bit of compassion here. So where did that number come from? Well, that's basically roughly what each of us who are, say, below the age of 35 are going to be responsible for in the years ahead. As our portion of this number. Uh-oh, I should have made it smaller. We're running out of board. 1,000, million, billion. I'm not great at math, but that's okay, neither's the government. So $205 trillion, that's the projected gap between how much the government expects to be spending in the future and how much it expects to actually be able to collect in tax revenue. And people quibble about the number, but no, the scale is something that is basically agreed upon. Now, what's driving that? What's driving this kind of unprecedented explosion in debt? Any brave souls? No brave souls. All right, no compassion and no braveness, but that's okay, we'll work through it. So the main drivers of these are old age welfare state programs, namely Social Security and Medicare. The problem's pretty simple, which is right now there's about 3 workers for every retiree, and as the baby boomer generation retires, we're going to get down to about 2 workers for each retiree. And the situation's actually worse than that, because right now those 3 workers are supporting about $30,000 per capita per retiree. That's going to rise to $40,000. Now, I'm not great at math, but even I can work out 2 workers, $40,000. You're dealing with a scale of debt, a scale of burdens placed on young people that's really not sustainable. Now, this is not really a conceivable number. It's not a realistic number. What this number means is that in order to pay its bills, the government would have to take $205 trillion instead of spending it on stuff, set it aside, and basically for infinity getting returns. Unfortunately, $205 trillion is more than we have lying around. It's more wealth than exists in the world. But let's make this a little more concrete and a little more relatable to our lives. So let's take 20% of the problem, Social Security. So right now, does anybody know what we pay each month in Social Security taxes? I thought I heard it, but you got to be louder and braver. 12.5%. Yeah, well, 12.4% technically. But that's good that you know. Most people don't know, and if you look at your paycheck each month, you'll have a little line item that says 6.2% of your money this month went to pay payroll taxes. And so you might be thinking, Don, even I can do math. 6.2 does not equal 12.4%. But it turns out that the government is very sly and very smart, and since the beginning has nominally split our payroll tax between the employer and the employee. But it also turns out that any economist will tell you that other half is really deducted from your paycheck. Your company's not giving it to you, they're just paying it to the government. So yeah, 12.4% of your income. Now for the average millennial worker just out of college, they're making about $40,000 a year. So 12.4% of that is somewhere over the neighborhood of $5,000 a year, which is more than a car payment each month that young people are forced to give to the elderly just today before they can start doing things like paying for their car payment, paying off their college loans, paying to move out of mom and dad's place. Another way to think about it is that that's about 6 weeks out of the year that each of us is working without remuneration. Now, I don't know about you, but if Walmart had a story published in the paper where it turned out that one of their managers were asking employees to work a weekend without pay, there would be riots in the street. They say, you can't do that, you're exploiting people. Now, in that case, the employee could leave and say, I don't want to be exploited. But in Social Security, 6 weeks, a month and a half each year, just for one program. And to close that gap, we're getting into 7 weeks. perhaps 8. And if we add in Medicare, well, I mean, heck, we're getting to a point where people are going to be spending, if we try to continue on this path, months and months of their lives having to set aside their hopes and dreams in order to give stuff to other people. Now, I call this the debt draft because I think in a real literal sense, it is conscripting young people into serving other people's retirement needs, other people's health care needs, and it's really going to come at the expense of the things that they want and need to achieve in order to live happy, successful lives. So I think there's a really important question of how do we get here and why? Why should we be on this path? What is a good alternative? And so I want to step back a little bit. And instead of just number crunching, I want to get a bigger picture look of what is the justification for these programs, and does the justification make any sense? So what are some of the arguments we've actually heard for why we have Social Security and Medicare? Why do we need old age welfare programs?
Because people don't save.
People don't save. And what happens if you don't save and you reach old age and you have no money and you can't work? Well, life's pretty bad, right? Yeah, so anyone else? Yeah.
People are too stupid to take care of themselves, and if they do, they don't do it right.
Yeah, that's definitely right. They're going to make bad decisions. So, I mean, if we put these two together, in effect, one kind of justification is it's necessary for economic security, because whether it's through bad luck, or just nature taking its course, or bad choices, a free market where there is no welfare state programs doesn't provide us the security we need to be happy and successful. Any others? Yes.
People's health fails. When they get to be about 65, things wear out and they can't work.
Yeah. So, but why does that mean we need welfare state programs?
Well,
Why?
I'm not saying that we do.
No. But why would people say that? They would listen to what you said and say, yeah, exactly. So we need these programs. But
Right.
but why? Why is that different from the fact of my car eventually runs down, I have to buy a new one, or I have to make plans to save for the next car.
Right. And they should save for when things go bad.
Yeah, but if they don't, right, it's our obligation to make sure that they're taken care of. Any other thoughts? I mean, come on, we've all heard, what happens if somebody says they want to reduce Social Security handouts just a little bit? Are they praised for being so financially savvy?
They're scared because they want to be voted back into office, and they know that the elder generation will vote them out.
Yeah, so the politician, it's an enormously popular program, right? I mean, yeah, and so what we're trying to get is the root of the popularity. I mean, you can sum it up in various different ways. In part, it's we're worried about people being poor, we're worried about them not being able to take care of themselves. We don't want to throw grandma off the cliff, to hearken to a charge that was made. Yeah.
Well, there's an attitude of, well, I paid into it, so I should be able to get out of it.
Well, that's
which is actually a false argument. But
well, yeah. So I'm going to write that down in a second. But I'm glad you named that, because that's
saved for you somewhere.
well, I'm going to have to put the kibosh on this debate. All right. So basically, what we have is two things. One, Watkins, it's not a welfare program in the first place. It's an earned benefit, right? That's what I heard you saying. I paid for it. I have a right to get something back. So don't tell me about this number. That's nonsense. And then the other thing that kind of came out in one way or another was it's the right thing to do. So basically, it's the idea of people paid for it and therefore they have a right to it. It's the idea that all of us face risks in life, particularly as we move into old age, and we need to make preparations for it. And so these programs are ways of preparing us for it and making sure that there's a safety net there for us. And then finally, it's that there's something moral about these programs. There's something moral about having programs that take care of people in old age. And so what I want to do tonight for the bulk of this discussion is I want to run through these. Now, as you can probably see, I'm very happy to get interaction as we go along, and so feel free to interrupt with a question or an objection if you don't think that I've said something right or you think that there's kind of pushback that should be gotten. I will, as we said, try to keep it under wraps a little bit because we have a lot to get through. So let's start here with the idea that it's an earned benefit. Now, let's make this a little clearer. So basically, this is kind of the image that people have of Social Security. So here's young me, and I'm happy because I'm young. Here's old me, and I'm sad, and I have a cane. But I'm not that sad because the government has been putting 12.4% of my money into a trust fund that eventually I'll be able to take out of and rest comfortably in old age. Problem is, that is totally false, as you suggested. Not true at all. Not at all how the program works. Now, the details of how it works are complicated, and we can talk about that. But the simple version is pretty simple. So here's me. Here's some other guy. And there's my money going to him. And actually, I'm sad because there goes my money. That's really all the program is. So Medicare is a little bit different. Obviously, it has more complexity because it's dealing with the government providing services in one form or another. But in essence, it's the same thing. What we're doing is we're taking money from young working people and we're giving it to older retirees. Now, this is not some like crazy theory that I've come up with. If you check out, for instance, Social Security for Dummies, this is hardly an ideological free market book. It's just telling people how the program works so that they can enjoy it when they get old. And it describes the program as a pipeline running from young workers to older retirees. A pipeline. That's an interesting conception. Now the question is, if this is how it works, can it be an earned benefit? So,
In one sense of the word, yes.
Uh-huh.
In another sense, no.
Okay.
I earned it because my money was being taken and I was under the assumption it was being put aside for me.
Uh-huh.
If it isn't, then the answer is no.
Uh-huh. I think that gets to the heart of the matter. I mean, basically, the theory that that's an earned benefit is kind of like saying that, you know, if Kyle Steele robs my wallet and now I don't have my wallet, I've lost my money, and so my earned benefit is to go and take Amanda's wallet. I mean, after all, I earned the money that was in there, and then it got taken from me. Now, you might think this is a good deal, that this is something important that we need to do as a society. You might think it's necessary for economic security and that it's the right thing to do, but it can't be an earned benefit. There was an injustice committed to us, right? So in a sense, we earned our money, and then unjustly it was taken away. And one of the great tragedies is that many today's retirees are dependent on Social Security for the bulk of their income. But that's not because the injustice of this guy wanting to keep his money. It's because he used to be this guy who was paying somebody else's bills. So not an earned benefit. What we have is a plain old welfare program. Again, might think it's a good welfare program, but it's not an earned benefit. Indeed, you could, if you think that it's an earned benefit, you could make the same argument of every form of government welfare. The fact is that the vast majority of people who go on what we traditionally call welfare, right? You know, just plain old dole or handouts, they're only on there for a couple months and then they're back on their feet. For the vast majority, that's true. Most of the time they're taxpayers, and then sometimes they're collecting. No, the fact is that this is exactly what a handout looks like. It looks like sometimes people are playing the role of victims, sometimes people are receiving the unearned. So then the question is that desirable? Do we want to have a welfare program for the elderly? Is that something that's necessary, and is that something that's right? And so let's look first at economic security and whether or not it's necessary. So what is economic security, by the way? We've kind of talked about it a little bit, but I want to dig a little bit deeper. What do we mean when we talk about economic security?
Have enough money for your basic necessities.
Yeah, that's one way people will put it. Sometimes that's what the safety net is supposed to kind of evoke, right? It's the idea that what you need, we're going to guarantee it in one way or another. So it's in effect guaranteed wealth, guaranteed income, guaranteed resources. Now I would argue that that is not a legitimate way to think about economic security, because there's no such thing as guaranteed wealth. I mean, what would it mean to say we have guaranteed homes and guaranteed buildings and guaranteed educations? Well, who's guaranteeing them? Because nature doesn't give us these things automatically. The only way you can give economic security by that standard is you force some people to provide others with stuff. The only rational meaning of economic security is really that if you do create something, if you do create a building, if you do earn a paycheck, somebody else can't come along and steal it. The fundamental meaning of economic security is precisely that you're free to take the actions necessary to provide and guarantee, provide yourself with the things that you need to live and to thrive. And now that creates a little bit of a problem for the welfare state if we're trying to see it as a means to achieving economic security. Because what does the welfare state do? Well, I erased it, but nevertheless, you have good memories. It takes away the stuff that people have earned. It's depriving them of economic security in a really important sense. Indeed, how economically secure are we headed towards that kind of crisis? But you might think, okay, Watkins, that's a nice way to play with words, but at the end of the day, what happens if a person gets sick or gets injured or can't work anymore and needs to be able to meet his needs in old age? Now, it turns out that we don't have to really theorize about what happens because, believe it or not, Social Security has not always existed in this country. And if you went to public school, you probably don't believe that. But it's true. Did anybody know when Social Security was created? What year?
1932.
I heard 36. I had 32. It's actually 1935. So we're in the ballpark. That's great. Yeah. So that means that for longer than we've had Social Security, America existed without it. And so the question is, what was happening? Because surely if the elderly were starving in the streets, as we're sometimes told, that would be at least a pretty good argument for maybe we do need it. We would need to really take that seriously. So did they starve in the streets? Now, this is what I cover extensively in my book. My book, the first half of it is the history of America before and after the welfare state. But I just want to talk about a little bit what people are doing. Because believe it or not, they did not starve in the streets. One indication of this, by the way, before we get into what they were actually doing, is what was happening with immigration during this period. Surely in a land where people were starving in the streets because there was no Social Security, they were fleeing to countries that did have welfare states, like Germany, right? No, I mean, this was the period of the greatest wave of immigration to America in history. Millions of people were coming here, including from places like Germany that had welfare states. Indeed, it's interesting, Social Security, as I said, gets passed in 1935. Progressive thinkers in America had been pushing for a welfare state in America since roughly the 1880s. So that's 50 years. Now, it turns out for the first 30 years or so of that, they have nothing to say about handout programs for the elderly. They say, look, and they say this explicitly, no, the American elderly are doing pretty well. We're concerned about the poor. But around 1900, they realized, we've been spending a few decades on this and nobody cares. Nobody wants to help the poor. But everybody likes older people. Most of us at one time or another aspire to being one. And so they decide, all right, we're going to focus on handouts for the elderly. And that's what we get in 1935. But what had people been doing before this? Now, you have to remember a little bit of the historic context at this time. America had been going through the Industrial Revolution. And so what the argument that FDR gave for Social Security was, look, the limited system of the Founding Fathers where you're responsible for all your own needs, that was fine before industrialization. But now, he said, life is becoming more and more insecure. Now, this was crazy because life was more and more secure than ever. People were living longer, they were earning more. That was the main retirement plan before industrialization, by the way. It was die. I mean, that was basically it, is you'd work and then you die, and then, hey, no retirement plan necessary. But because of industrialization, we're living longer, we have more wealth, but it did create new challenges. Namely, one of the things you would do often in old age is you would just live on the farm with your family, and then your family would take care of you and so on. And as we'll see, that still went on in the cities, but as people were moving away from their families, there were new challenges, right? So what things did people do? Because it turns out Americans, they knew that they would eventually get older. And these people were so farsighted, it's amazing. But they knew that, hey, it's coming, and they made plans for it. So any clues to some of the things they did rather than starve in the streets when they got old? Yeah? So savings. Now, it turns out that they did, excess wealth is kind of a funny phrase, but they nevertheless did save between 1/8 and 1/9 of their incomes, which, given that today our savings rate is plus or minus 1%, really hovering around 0, pretty incredible. But yeah, people saved because they knew that life gives you challenges and that you might not be able to always work. Although one of the things they often did do is continue to work. And this was not in most cases because, oh, I'm so miserable and so poor, what else am I going to do? One of the things the left would complain about for years, even after creating Social Security, is that these people keep wanting to work. It turns out that people did not want to live purposeless lives where they were just sitting around for decades. A lot of people wanted to work. That's where they got a feeling of a self-esteem, purpose, and so on. So to the extent that people were healthy, they very often continued to work and to support themselves. Any other ideas about what was going on?
There was a pretty extensive network of what they call mutual aid societies and things like that, in the 19th century that developed.
Where were you 5 years ago when I started researching this? I had never heard of that. Yeah, mutual aid. So, I mean, you explained it well. Basically, people would join these social clubs that eventually turn into Elks Lodges and Moose Lodges today. If you've ever, my grandfather was part of one. He was the Grand Poobah. And we said, what does that mean? He goes, I don't know, but I get free beer. So, yeah, you'd pay a small membership fee, and that would give you contractual rights to things that were in effect primitive forms of insurance, whether it was unemployment, sickness, injury, you'd have a lodge doctor, and very often they had old age retirement homes for members who didn't have anybody to take care of them. And there was a bunch of other things. People had insurance, life insurance, and even if, obviously, you can't retire on your life insurance, but you could in emergencies cash it in and so on. A lot of informal help from friends and family. I mentioned before, it was very common, and it continued to be common for a long time, for people to, if they couldn't support themselves, move back in with their children. And then finally there was private charity. And indeed, charity was, as a percent of GDP, Americans spent more on charity in those days than we do even today. So the bottom line is that there was a bunch of ways that free people were providing real economic security for themselves. They earned wealth and then they used it in ways to meet their needs and deal with life's risks. So what was the bottom line? Far from starving in the streets, again, people were flooding here. It was the land of opportunity. And now we don't have great statistics from this time. We actually have very, very poor statistics from this time, but the best statistics we do have suggest that no more than 8% of the elderly were dependent, even in part, on either private charity or the minuscule kind of government charitable programs there were at the state and local level at the time. 92% of them were in one way or another meeting their needs into old age and were living longer into old age than ever before. Now, we need to take a second. 8%, that's not a great number from today's perspective. I mean, given how wealthy we are, I would hope to see that it would be less than 1% that would be dependent on private charity. But we have to remember the context here. And the context looks more or less like this. So let's go back to, say, the beginning of time, and then plot out kind of like GDP per capita. Well, it basically goes like this, starting in roughly 1800. So basically, we're just doing a little bit better than starving to death. And then roughly 1800 it starts shooting up. Here's where we are today. We're talking about roughly, somewhere right here. Economic freedom had only started to enrich us. Industrialization had only started to give us the resources to make our lives amazing. And so the fact that even in that era, even when we had far less economic resources and far less knowledge about things like insurance, investing, and so on that we do today, still, we had a situation in which only a handful of people had to turn to outside charity in order to be able to live. So that's kind of what I would leave as the bottom line for economic security. This is something that we can, and in my view, should provide for ourselves under freedom, and that what the welfare state is doing is actually creating immense economic security because it basically allows the government to say, hey, guess what? We can take as much money from you for whatever resources, for whatever purposes we regard as right, as good. And at that point, you're at the mercy of the system. So let's then turn to the final point. Although, any questions so far?
Yeah, I have one.
Yeah.
Given that Social Security came right in the middle of Roosevelt's depression, wouldn't you say that the part of the argument for that, for its imposition, was the at least perceived destruction of the means of storing savings, i.e. the banks and the financial system where you would put your excess capital for retirement?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I assume everybody got the gist of it. Basically, this is taking place during the Great Depression, and suddenly all the means of kind of saving and providing for your own life seem very unstable. Definitely, I talk a little bit in my book about what happens. There was a feeling, a sense among Americans since the beginning of this country that I'm in control of my destiny. Where I end up is not a result fundamentally of luck or anything. It's my choices, and I can deal with life's challenges. And one of the things that happens during the Great Depression is that people start to get shook to the core, and they start to think, maybe I'm not in control of my fate. Maybe I'm not in control of my economic, destiny the way that I thought I was. In which case, maybe I'm seeking some sort of guarantee, even though, as we've seen, there is really no such thing as a guarantee. And so I think that definitely went into it. Now, this is kind of going beyond the scope, but so I'll just assert this, and then we can talk about it later in the Q&A if anyone wants to follow up. The Great Depression certainly, and depressions in generally, don't result from a free market. I'm not an expert in the Great Depression itself, but I think there's strong, overwhelming evidence that, it was a government-created problem. And then even if you thought it was a problem, the solution, it's hard to see how the solution is, let's just take a bunch of money from young people and give it to old people. It's hard to make sense of that, particularly when we look at, if you look at how, for instance, stocks play out over time, even after, say, the 2008 recession, you do better investing in those than you do relying on handouts from other people. But yeah, that's a good point. So turning then to it's the right thing to do. In one sense, who can argue with that, right? If what we mean by it's the right thing to do, that you don't want to see people starving in the streets, you don't want to see people unable to support themselves, and there seems to be something wrong about just turning a blind eye to somebody who needs your help. Now, what I want to suggest is that the welfare state has nothing to do with whether or not you want to help somebody who's facing an emergency. That the two have nothing in common. The desire to want to help somebody, as we've seen, people were doing that all the time in America before the welfare state. All the time they were helping out others. That doesn't justify a welfare state. It justifies, for instance, you helping somebody that you care about. The welfare state says something different, and here's the way that I like to think about it. So, don't ask for a minute, would I help somebody, or do I want to help somebody, or am I the kind of benevolent person who would take care of somebody in an emergency? Ask yourself instead what you would do if you found yourself in need. So, you find out, for instance, you need an operation you can't afford. And now you have two choices. You go over to your neighbor, and here's your neighbor, and you can ask him, hey, look, I've hit on some tough times, and I need some help. Will you help me pay for this operation? So that's option one. Option two is that you pull out your giant gun and you say, give me your money, I need it, it's mine. Now, I'm exaggerating this a little bit, but in essence, these are really the two choices, is you ask for people's help or you demand it. You say that your need entitles you to help. Now, I've asked thousands of people, so I'm not going to insult your intelligence or morality by taking a poll, but I've never met anybody who goes, yeah, I would feel entitled to demand or even pull out a gun and say, you owe me. Most of us, our attitude would be, I hope he'll help me, but if my neighbor turned and said, hey, I'm trying to pay for my daughter's education, I'm trying to start a business, I'm trying to pay for my mortgage, I just can't do it, I have other priorities I have to attend to, our reaction would be, I understand, and hopefully I can find somebody else, some other way to pay for my operation. But the point about the welfare state is that it's not about helping, it's about entitlement. It's about the idea that if you have a need that your neighbor has the capacity to fulfill, then you have a right to have it fulfilled by him. That morally, in principle at least, you would be right to go demanding his money. And if he said no, he had other priorities, he would be in the wrong. The whole essence and the whole moral claim being made by the welfare state is that handouts are a right. The fact that you need them, the fact that a person might need money that other people are in a position to give him entitles it. Their need is a debt on the rest of us. And so the question is there any basis for that? What is the argument for that? One of the things to keep in mind is that we talked about what was going on before the welfare state and that people were able to flourish and to deal with life's risks through all sorts of voluntary means, including private charity. The welfare state, it's not that we just should sit back and compare them and go, which one is the most efficient way to help people? Because what was striking about America before the welfare state was that people were supporting themselves and helping others where nobody was being forced to sacrifice for anyone else. You could help the people you cared about in ways that you could afford. The welfare state says it's irrelevant whether you care about them. You might even think they're immoral creeps who made themselves needy through their own bad choices, but you have an obligation to help them. And it's irrelevant whether you can afford it. You don't get to decide what you can afford. We get to decide what you, quote, can afford, and we don't really care. What the issue is their need. So we're dealing with a radically different moral scenario, yeah.
So an argument is often advanced that what about that one guy who really has nobody?
Give me a scenario like that.
I know. So you're saying that they don't really, nothing like this really exists?
Well, what I am saying is this. So first of all, it's kind of a weird argument. Hey, there's going to be 3 or 4 people who slip through the cracks, so let's create an enormous $1 trillion a year system that all of us are going to be forced to pay for and all of us are going to be dependent on, and that aren't just going to provide a minimum living, but will try to make it possible for us to live totally on without any form of any other income. So it's kind of a weird, argument. I can think of more efficient ways to help 4 people or 3 people or 1 person or whatever it is. And I don't think it's because I'm particularly intelligent. This is not that kind of a problem. But the second one is, concretize it for a second. So what would you have to do in order to end up where nobody's going to help you? So first of all, you'd have to have no ability to support yourself, no savings, no insurance, no friends, no family, no neighbors, no co-workers, no private charity willing to help you. You'd have to be pretty much of a jerk. I mean, frankly, now does it mean that there could not be a case of that happen? It's certainly not. And I mean, the same thing is true of a welfare state. Do we think there aren't people who in effect slip through the cracks one way or another? Indeed, not everybody's even eligible for Social Security because you actually have to have earnings over a certain period of time. So it doesn't even solve that problem, which is one of the things the left often complains about. So that's in effect a cover-up for what's really going on. What's really going on is not, hey, we're worried that somebody will slip through the cracks. It's the idea that what we think is, it's irrelevant whether you earn something. What's morally relevant is what a person needs, and we need to sacrifice for those in need. Another way to put this is it's the right thing to do because your role is not to pursue your own happiness, but to be your brother's keeper, to be a servant. And this ties back then to what I was saying about the debt draft and why I call it a draft. Anybody know the comedian Russell Brand? You ever hear of him? Married to Katy Perry, if that helped. Probably, if you don't know Russell, you probably don't know Katy. Anyway, so I was supposed to be in a show a couple of years ago to debate selfishness, and it never came together, but we did kind of a practice run where we went into a comedy club and did this debate live on stage. And just as an aside, if you're ever going to come and defend selfishness and want to get the crowd on your side, bring your pregnant wife and stick her in the front row. People go far gentler on you for some reason. So Anyway, we go there, but afterwards I'm talking to Russell, and I'm talking about this whole problem, right? And I said, look, this is turning kids into servants. And he said about the welfare state, isn't that the point? And he's right. The whole perspective of the welfare state is that you should be a servant. And so the fact that this debt is going to lead young people to have to give up a lot of their hopes and dreams in order to serve others is not a problem. It's exactly what should be happening. And they might quibble about the details, but morally in principle, yes, we should be drafted into debt, because under the welfare state's view of the individual, you're one of two things. You're either a burden or a resource. You're a burden when you're in need. You're a resource when you're in a position to take care of all those burdens. Now, I think that far from being a moral view of human beings and human existence, I regard that as an incredibly immoral view. The view that we're just basically a whole bunch of resources to be exploited, or a whole bunch of exploiters, that is certainly not the view of the individual the Founding Fathers held. It's definitely not the view that you get of the individual that you get reading Ayn Rand's books. And it's certainly not the view that I think we should aspire to in our own lives. The whole essence of America before the welfare state, the ideal was that each of us is independent to live our own lives. And then we dealt with one another in voluntary, win-win, cooperative ways. And if we couldn't, we were free to go our own way. We weren't all caught in a collective web of being sacrificed and sacrificing for others. So, I have some more summing up points, but any other questions at this point so far before we go on?
Yeah, what do you say to Russell Brand when he gives you something that is so naked in its evil like that? Besides gasp, what do you say to something like that? What's a good response?
Well, I mean, my response was utter speechlessness. Not because I was shocked. This guy said way more awful things. But what I was shocked was just how revealing it was of what was going on and how everybody accepts that, yeah, that's a moral way to constitute a society. There's two ways to think about the response. If you think the person's open to it and they just don't realize the implications, then you can point out the implications. And that's what I'm trying to do, is say that if your view is, well, yeah, people should be servants, what you're doing is you're treating them as burdens and resources rather than independent beings who have the right to pursue happiness. And there's much to say about why one view is right and one is wrong. I mean, that's the whole essence of, say, Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. But in most cases, if a person really holds that view and certainly holds it that explicitly, there's no convincing them. It's not like Russell's going to go, oh, I didn't realize that we should be dedicated to the pursuit of our own happiness and not sacrifice ourselves to others or others to ourselves. Man, I should really pick up Atlas Shrugged. There's no scenario like that. I mean, they're just too far gone. But if I was going to, let's say there was the crowd in front of us at that point, which there wasn't, my response would simply be, you don't have a right to exploit me. I am not a resource for you to exploit. In effect, you just make a moral assertion, assertion of self-esteem that you have a right to live for your own sake. And there's no real way of standing up against that on their part. So, I want to, yeah.
They may not have a right to stand up against it, but they do because it's the government.
Oh, well, the government will enforce it. But my point is that if you're dealing, in these kinds of scenarios, what you're trying to do is sweep the rug out from under the people arguing for a certain moral perspective and say, look, you're claiming that you guys are the harbingers and bearers of compassion and that I'm a cruel person who doesn't care about anybody else. But it's really the exact reverse, is that they have no compassion for the individual, no respect for the individual, and no respect for the individual's right to live a life and achieve happiness, and that it's only the person who respects the individual's freedom who can claim things like compassion and respect for the individual. That doesn't change government overnight, and we can talk about how to do that, although if you know how to do it overnight, you should be up here giving the talk, because I sure don't. All right, the bigger picture to bring this all together now is, I think, underlying this whole debate about the welfare state is something I call the Garden of Eden premise. And that's the idea that, before I go to that, I forgot to make a kind of point about the bigger picture damage done by Social Security. So I've talked about some of the reasons why I think it's not necessary and immoral, but I want to get at the deeper destructiveness of it. It's not just that it takes money away from us. That's only one aspect of the bigger problem. The bigger problem is, so let's say that Social Security actually did not work by just taking money from one person. Let's say it really did work by the government, had this nice trust fund where it put in 12.4%. So let's say it really was you when you're young, money saved and invested, say like in a 401k that you owned, and then you got it back when you're old. I would argue that that in principle is no better. It may be less damaging, but in principle it's no better. And let me get it quickly why I think that's right. Well, here's one way to do it. My dad and I have very different goals for old age. So, he's basically spent the last decade or two running 2 tech companies simultaneously, exhausted, would love to have a couple decades to, just play golf and travel the world with my mom. I, on the other hand, want to work as long as I can. Now, given those 2 different goals, we would take very different approaches to planning for old age. He would save a lot more. I would save a lot less. I would have enough to deal with, say, an emergency where I couldn't do that. We would also probably start our horizons at different times. I might wait until I'm in my later 30s and earning more, and then use my resources when I'm young to do things that I could only do when I'm young, whether it's start a family or say, go on certain kinds of vacations or whatnot. The bottom line is what this would do. If 12.4% is set aside come hell or high water, the government is taking away the freedom to make those kinds of assessments on our own. It's interfering with our freedom to plan our own lives. And so is it less damaging that, yeah, I lose out when I'm young but get something back when I'm old? Perhaps it's less damaging, but it's still part of the same damage. It's taking away my ability to make the best decisions for my life and allowing the government to say, no, we have a trump card. Whenever we think we know better, whenever we think that we know what's best for your life, or that we think you should be serving society rather than being concerned with what's best for your life, we get to interfere. When that becomes the approach, we lose. And when I say we lose, it means those of us who are willing to take responsibility for our lives lose. Those of us who are willing to exercise the thought and effort life requires lose out. And that gets into the bigger picture of what's going on in this debate, which I was starting to get to before. So the Garden of Eden premise. This really comes from the idea that, life shouldn't require us to be responsible, to make good decisions, to exert all this effort. It should just guarantee us all the things we want, like the Garden of Eden. They should drop into our laps. And you know what? Reality, it is being so stubborn because it's not giving us what we need automatically and without effort. So what we're going to do, we're going to create a society that basically tries to make it as much like a Garden of Eden as possible. Now, how? Well, since it doesn't give us the resources that we need in life, we're just going to take them from those who have them and give them to those who don't. Now, in principle, that sounds pretty unfair, right? If we're just going to take stuff from people who earned it through their thought and effort and give it to those who didn't, that seems hard to justify. So what we're going to do is we're going to come up with a bunch of arguments to justify it. So, for instance, you didn't actually earn your money in the first place. You didn't build that. Society gave it to you. Your success is a matter of luck. We're not taking what you earned. We're taking what you were lucky enough to happen upon because some other people weren't lucky enough to happen upon it. And then, by the way, justice isn't about giving you what you earn anyway. Justice is about social justice. It's about giving you what you need, whether or not you earned it. And that's the whole, it's the right thing to do argument. All of the arguments are really trying to justify and this whole Garden of Eden way of constructing a society. But the fact is, we don't live in a Garden of Eden. We live in something much better. We live in a glorious earth where You can have all the things that you want, but you have to pay the price. You have to exert the thought, effort, decision-making, and create the political freedom to protect your ability to do that in a successful way. And so my view ultimately of the debt draft is that the only moral solution is to abolish it, to stop treating people as burdens and resources, to stop conscripting them into service, liberate each of us so that we can make those decisions, make the most of our own lives. And I think if we did that, far from worrying about disaster, we would be dealing with the greatest amount of prosperity and happiness possible to human beings. So with that, thank you, and I'm going to take questions until they shut us down.